talk tonight about Satan's sifting process. The Bible tells us that Satan likes to target people. In Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2, the Bible tells us that Satan wanted to target Job. A lot of great lessons about that there. Satan had to get God's permission to do it. And God put limits on what Satan could do. But Satan targeted Job. And then you find out that he targeted Joshua the high priest. That's in the book of Zechariah chapter 3. He targeted David. 1 Chronicles 21, and there's some lessons in that. The Bible in one place tells us the Lord led David to number people. But in another place it says Satan led him. And so some people have pondered on that. How can you explain that? But what happens, and you find this over and over again, whenever the devil targets somebody, God is using the situation. And you also find that when the Lord is using somebody, Satan targets the situation. There was an Old Testament procedure for numbering the people. David didn't follow it. Satan maneuvered David into doing the right thing the wrong way. And turning the right thing into the wrong thing. We know that Satan targeted Pharaoh. Satan targeted David. Satan targeted Peter. That's what the Lord's trying to warn him about here. Satan even targeted Christ, tempting him in the desert. And Satan targeted Paul. We'll get to that in a minute. And so the lesson is, Satan just might target you. It's his sifting process. Would you look with me? We're here in Luke chapter 22, and we're going to go to verse 31. And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. Now, be careful with this. The Bible is very clear in its teaching that once you've gotten saved, Satan can never have one moment of your eternity.
Amen.
Your eternity is lost to him. That doesn't mean he can't have you. He wants to have you here in this life.
Yes, sir.
He wants to control your thinking and your behavior and your attitude. Now, I know some folks don't believe this. Some folks believe if you're saved, you're always triumphant. You always live in victory over everything and every challenge that comes your way. But the truth is, most of the Bible is written to us to warn us about not being faithful.
Yes, sir.
Satan wants you now, even though if you're saved, he cannot have your eternity.
Yeah.
He wants you now.
Right.
He can't control what happens to you 1,000 years from now. But he wants to control what happens to you tomorrow. Oh, got that. And he wants Peter. And then verse 32, but I have prayed for thee, thy strength fail not, thy faith fail not, brother, when thou art converted, strengthen thy brother. And he said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with thee, both into prison and to death. Peter got like a lot of Christians. Devil. I can handle the devil. This is no big deal. He can't have me. I got everything under control. That's a very dangerous attitude for any Christian to have. And you see how the Lord responded to it. And he said, Lord, is the he there. He said, I will tell thee, Peter, the cock shall not crow this day, thrice this day, before thou shalt crow this day, before thou shalt thrice deny that thou knowest me.
Yes, sir.
He said, 3 times this very day, right after you told me you can handle all this, 3 times this very day, Satan's going to get control of you for a while. And you all know the story, how that happened. It's a very famous, well-known biblical story. Would you go with me for a moment to 2 Corinthians chapter 12? Well, we hear the story of another person who is targeted by Satan. And what happens? The Apostle Paul. And again, this is an example how the Lord and Satan are both at work at the same time, or for different purpose. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. Lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations. See, there's a danger in Paul's ministry. God had given him an abundance of revelation. I think most folks feel pretty sure that he wrote a number. He wrote 13 books of the New Testament. Some folks debate Hebrews, but if you count Hebrews, and I do, it's 14. And there was a danger in having been used of God to write 14 books of Scripture. You know what the danger was? That you'd get proud that God had used you to write 14 books of Scripture, and you begin to take credit for what God did when you were there. So he said, because of that, God did something, and Satan did something in the same way. He said, unless I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations that was given me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. So here's what's going on. The devil has a plan. The Lord has a plan. The Lord is going to use something that the devil wants to do to keep Paul humble. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what it was, except that it was a thorn in the flesh. It was a messenger from Satan. Secular history tells us. You can't always count on that, but secular history tells us that what happened was that Paul had a disease of the eyes that caused his eyes to always be filled with infection. An infection would run like pus runs from a little wound. The infection would run from all around his eyes, and it made it hard to look at him. It made him repulsive looking. That will take away some of your pride. If you're repulsive looking and it's hard for people to look at you. Satan did that to him physically, but again, Satan can only do what the Lord lets him do. The reason Satan wants to do that is he wants to defeat and discourage Paul. The reason the Lord allowed it is so that Paul could remain humble in spite of the unique, amazing way that God had used him. Satan wants to sift Paul. The Lord wants to do something good for Paul. Amen. Verse 8. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. He said, I went to God 3 times. I said, God, would you please deliver me from this? And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. God says, I'll give you the strength to get through this. Didn't say take it away. He said, I'll give you the strength to get through it. And he says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. God is not exalted when people do things that it looks like they're great enough and strong enough to do. God is exalted when people are getting things done for God that it's plain as day that only God could be possible. He said, my grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. A few lessons that I want us to get from Satan's sifting process. First of all, when Satan comes after us, it does not mean we have done anything wrong. The whole book of Job is about that. Job had not sinned. Job's caught in the middle of a debate between Satan and the Lord. Job is saying, I can cause Job not to love you. I can cause Job not to be faithful to you. I can cause Job not to serve you. And he says, Job is only loves you because you've done so much for him. And so the Lord allows Satan to go after him, and Job has the most horrible day I've ever read of anybody ever had. And one day, he goes from being the richest man in his area to being in absolute poverty. Now that's terrible. That's not the worst thing. He has 10 children. And in one day, all 10 of his children are killed. It's a horrible day. But Job goes on being faithful to the Lord. The Bible tells us twice before it gives us the record of all this that Job is the most spiritual man on the face of the earth. And Job doesn't understand what God is doing, but Job goes on to serve the Lord. Job and still the subject of argument between Satan and the Lord. The Lord says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And Job says, "Yeah, but he's not in pain. That's the only reason he loves you. He's not in pain. You let me put him in pain and he'll curse you." So the Lord allows him to touch Job's body the same way that centuries later he will allow Satan to touch Paul's body. But he says you can't kill it because Satan's never the one in charge. So he fills Jacob's body with boils. I don't know if you've ever had a boil. Infection gets in a pore of the skin. Pores are little tiny things. And an infection gets there, and that infection will grow and grow and grow and grow, and it will stretch the skin far beyond how the skin was designed to be stretched. And as it stretches the skin, it'll hurt. If you've ever had one boil can give you enough pain to keep you from doing normal things. Twice in my life I've had one boil. I was preaching in Alaska one night, and I had a boil grow up while I was preaching. And the pain was back in my neck. The pain was so great that by the time I got done with the sermon, I said, "Take me to the hospital." They had to take a scalpel and cut out all the infection. And cutting it out hurts less than letting it grow. Job didn't have one boil. The Bible says he had boils on the top of his head. He had boils on the bottom of both feet. You know what happened if you had a boil on the bottom of one foot? You'd walk leaning on the other foot. But you want to know what happens if we have boils on both feet? You can't walk. He had boils on his face, boils on his chest, boils on his back. And when we see Job, he's in an ash heap. And he has an old piece of pottery. And you know why he's there? The Bible doesn't tell us this, but it's obvious. He's taking that piece of pottery and he's trying to cut the boils open to get the infection out. And the reason he's doing it in the ash heap is to try and put the ashes on the wound. Not the most pleasant way to deal with a wound, but it beats nothing. Horrible pain. And yet, Satan was sifting him. Yet, Job stayed faithful to the Lord. Here's some lessons. Number one, Satan might want to target you someday. That's reality. A lot of people today teaching what's called prosperity theology. It is not Bible doctrine. It doesn't come from the Bible. Prosperity theology is the teaching that if you're right with God, you're always healthy. You're right with God, you're always wealthy. And if you're right with God, you're always happy. The Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible teaches you're living in a sin-cursed body. And sometimes your sin-cursed body will break down. Matter of fact, this is a temporary body. Sooner or later, it'll break down completely. Not only are you living in a sin-cursed body, you've got a sin nature. Your sin nature will work against you. Not only do you have a sin nature, everybody around you has a sin nature. And their sin nature will work against you. Marriage is a beautiful, wonderful thing when both a husband and wife honor God. But sometimes folks get married thinking they're going to be happy always, and it turns out to be a lot of trouble, because here's what's happened. Before you got married, when you were single, there was one sin nature. When you get married, you got two sin natures to deal with every day. And then you have children, and each one of your children have a sin nature. So you might get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 sin natures to deal with every day. Then there's a world system that is organized for sin and against God. You're not going to be healthy all the time. You're not going to be happy all the time. You're not going to be rich all the time. You're living in a sin-cursed world. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong when Satan targets you. In fact, often it means you were doing something right. And the reason that Satan wants to stop you is because you were doing something right. And different times in the Bible as you read about this, you find that Satan wants to use physical difficulty against you. He wants to use financial difficulty against you. He wants to use your family sometimes against you. I grew up in a home that was kind of unusual. My father was an atheist. My mom was a Calvinist. My aunts and uncles were all Calvinists. And my Calvinist part of the family believed some things that were unbiblical. They believed God predestined some people to be saved and other people to be lost, and there's nothing you can do about it. So they believed that missions was always wrong. They said if God wanted to save these people, whatever people, He'd do it without us. They believed giving out tracts was wrong. They believed soul winning was wrong. They believed invitations at a church service were wrong. They believed full-time preachers were wrong. Between my junior and senior year of high school, I became convinced that God had called me to preach. To be a Bible preacher, not a Calvinist preacher. And I started to go that direction. My mom was furious. My aunts and uncles were furious. They did everything they could think of to discourage me and defeat me from the work of the Lord. By the way, I was 17 that summer. And they used to tell me every day, you'll be sorry, you'll regret this. If you do this, you'll be sorry the rest of your life. I'm 65 now. And the being sorry part hadn't started yet. But Satan was using family to try and defeat me. He'll use persecution. We sure are blessed in the United States in that we don't have much persecution. You sure are blessed in the Philippines that you don't have much persecution. But I will tell you, there's some places in the world where the amounts of persecution are huge and amazing. 2005, I got to spend a week in Syria. The believers there are persecuted all the time. I flew from Syria home. It's like I wanted to kiss the ground when I got back in the United States. Because I was watching those folks live with persecution every day. And I never knew. But Satan will use that when he can. Satan will use slander. I'm going to tell you right now, if you're going to serve the Lord and be used of God, people will lie about you. It's part of the program. The devil will use it to try and discourage you and defeat you. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Satan will use these things to sift you and try and stop you, just like he's using Peter. And at that moment, Peter's going to get afraid of the Roman authorities. And the devil is going to try and use that to defeat Peter. Now, here's another lesson. Y'all ready? You won't like this one. The devil could win. He cannot win your eternity after you're saved. He can win your tomorrow. Lots of Christians go through times of being sifted. They let the devil defeat them, and the devil wins in this life, even though he never wins in eternity. Second church I pastored 3 churches. Second church I pastored, there was a man just lived 2 blocks from the church. He'd been a member of the church since he was a little boy. When I got there, he was ill, and he wasn't able to come to church. But as a pastor, it was easy to visit him because he only lived, 3-minute walk from the church. We're getting close to his death. And we're talking about things like his funeral and all. And he said, Pastor, I have to tell you a secret. And he said, it's the shameful secret of my life. He said, when I was a boy, God called me to be a missionary. He said, I knew that as real as anything in my life that God had called me to be a missionary. But he said, I didn't want to pay the price. I didn't want to go to Bible college. I didn't want to live away from the things of the world. He said, I did not want to pay the price. He said, I knew I should go to Bible college when I graduated from high school. But I said, not now, I'll go in a year. He said, in a year later, I said, well, not now, I'll go in a year. He said, I kept putting it off, and finally I said, well, someday when I'm retired, I'll go be a missionary. But he said, then when I retired, I was kind of tired and worn out. So I said, maybe next year. And he said, now I'm about to die. He said, I probably only have months left to live. And it turned out he didn't have that. He only had a few days to live. He said, there's no way now for me to go live the life that God had for me to live. And he said, I have to die knowing that I wasted my life. You know what happened? Satan won with him. Satan can win with you too. Satan can win with me. That's the bad news. That could happen. You want to know what the good news is? You can win. Now listen to me on this. Salvation is not you winning. Salvation is Jesus doing what was necessary to save your soul. If you get saved, it's the Lord that won. But if you live for God and serve God and become the person God wants you to be, that's you winning. You can win if you're faithful to the Lord. I'll never forget, years ago, I'm running a Christian camp. And we have young people there for a week. They come in on Monday morning, they stay through Saturday morning. And we had a godly Christian young lady there. She's a very pretty young lady. And a fellow showed up who wasn't saved. He was a football player and a big guy, and a guy the girls all thought was good looking and all that. He began to pay attention to this pretty Christian girl. And he was bragging to me. We were in the middle of a huge woods, the camp was. He said, I'll have her sneaking out in the woods with me before the week's over. You wait and see. I was camping. I got mad. I said, no, you won't. I'm sending you home today. And I was making arrangements to send him home, and a young lady came to me and said, Brother Stringer, would you please trust me? I got this. She said, I've made certain promises to the Lord. I said, okay, I'll trust you. But I'm a big believer in trust but verify. So I got his counselor and her counselor, and I said, I want you to report to me every night when they're in their cabin, when they're supposed to be. You come tell me she's in her cabin. You come past the director's house, tell me he's in his cabin. And just so I know. Friday night, her counselor came to me distraught. She couldn't find her. His counselor came to me distraught. He couldn't find him. I was furious. I had folks checking everything we could check, but the truth is we had hundreds of acres of woods. There was no way to check it all. There were 4 main paths into the camp from the woods. I posted somebody on each one of them. I said, I want you to tell me just as soon as they come in. I was angry. People that saw me said my face had turned purple. I don't think Filipinos' faces turn purple. Mine had. Walked over to my house, the house I was staying in, just so angry. I get in, and they're sitting there in my living room talking to my wife. They have forgotten to tell their counselors where they were going. They're waiting for me to come in. I walked in. The young man stands up. He does not look at me. He looks at the young lady and says, you win. And then he looks at me and says, I want to get saved. Amen. You know what he was saying? He said, your testimony. I can't argue against your testimony. You win this battle. And he got saved. Amen. You could win. Even though Satan wants to sift you, Satan wants to attack you, Satan wants to do something to you, you could win. Amen. Amen. You might lose temporarily. And then get right with God to go on and win. Peter loses this fight that day. He fails the Lord that day. He gets afraid that day. And Satan wins that day. But is that the end of the story of Peter? Peter preaches on the day of Pentecost. And 3,000 people get saved. And that was the day. I can't speak for any preacher, other preachers, but the most preachers ever got saved in one sermon, or most people ever got saved in one sermon I preached was 311. I consider that a great day. I have wonderful memories of that day. I can't even imagine what it would be like to have 3,000 people saved in a day. Then later, he preached in another service, and it says 5,000 men got saved in that service. I'd like to preach in a service, Pastor, where 5,000 men get saved. Wouldn't that be something? And then the Bible says that he preached in the Roman province of Asia. Now that's not the Asia, the big continent we think of, but that's a province in modern day Turkey, and it's a pretty good sized area. And he preached in Asia, and the Bible says everybody in Asia got saved. That's an amazing story. It's almost hard to believe. Except I will tell you, I've seen a couple things that kind of make that easier for me to understand. Amazon River. It's the biggest river in the world. It's in South America. It runs through 6 countries. It goes over 1,000 miles. Over 1,000 other rivers come off the Amazon River. Each river creates a valley. And in each valley, a civilization developed. And if you just go back to the early 1800s, every one of those valleys was pagan civilization. But God's done work in some of them. Back in the 1950s, a woman named Sophie Mueller went to one of those valleys where a white man had never been, and no one had ever preached the gospel. She got off at a river town and then went back in that valley because she wanted the Lord to take her somewhere that no one had ever witnessed anybody. She got there. There were 800 villages in that valley. Every village was at war with every other village. Kidnapping, murder, pillage, rape were everyday occurrences. She walks into the first village. They know a little bit of trade Spanish, and she knows a little bit of trade Spanish. So she tells them, the Creator God, the real one, that created the world, sent me to tell you something. He wants you to know He's angry at you. And the reason He's angry at you is because of all your sin. But He also wants you to know He loves you. Because He loves you, He sent His Son to pay the penalty for your sin, so that if you would believe in the Creator God's Son, you could be forgiven your sin.
Amen.
They got angry. They decided to poison her. They whipped up a batch of poison, tried it on 2 dogs who dropped easily, made it look like soup. The dogs died just like that. They fed her the soup, and she didn't die. And the tribe had a legend that one day the daughter of God would come to their tribe. So the chief went to her and asked her, and they barely understand what each other's saying, but he went to her and said, "Are you the daughter of God?" What would you ladies say if somebody asked you if you were the daughter of God? The Bible says you got adopted when you got saved. So she said, "Yes, I'm the daughter of God." So the chief called the whole tribe together and said, "The daughter of God has come to live among us. Do whatever she tells you to do." She gathered the whole tribe together and told them again, "The Creator God sent me to see you. He's angry at you. He's angry at you because He hates the killing, the rape, the stealing, the murdering, the plundering. But even though He's angry at you, He loves you. And your sin has to be paid for, but He sent His Son to pay for your sin. And if you put your faith in what His Son did, you can be forgiven." And some of the men got it, and they got saved. Now she said, "There's one more thing. It's your job to tell the next village." They go down the path. The villages were very close together. I was there in 2000. They go down the path. This is the 1950s. They go to the next village. They walk in with their arms raised so they'd see it's not a raid. That's normally the only reason you go to another village. But they didn't have any weapons. They walked in with their hands up so they could see they didn't have any weapons. And they said, we just found out something. And we thought you should know. Turns out the Creator God, not our local village gods, but the Creator God, the one who created the whole world, He's mad at us. He doesn't approve of how we're treating each other. He thinks it's sin when we kill each other, steal from each other, rape and pillage. But here's the important part. He still loves us. And He sent His Son to pay for our sin. And if you put your faith in what His Son did, and some of the men in that village got saved. So they said, now one more thing, it's your job to tell the next village. Yeah. And they go down to tell the next village the same way. She didn't come out for 24 years. The people that sent her there thought she died. She was an American. After 24 years, she shows back up in America. Tells the story, and they now have gospel preaching churches in 400 villages. She gets some help, and they go back and start churches in the other 400 villages. It's an amazing place. Every village in the valley has a gospel preaching church, and every village has a rule: they will not allow any church in that village that does not preach the gospel. 800 churches in that valley, and every one of them preaches the gospel. Virtually everyone in that valley is saved. It's the most Christian place I ever saw. It's more Christian than anywhere in the United States. It's more Christian than the Philippines. It's mind-boggling. Everybody is safe. Children can play in the street at 2 o'clock in the morning. Elderly people can be wandering the town, and there's no fear. Alcohol is not sold in any of the towns. They say there's a place out in the jungle that's called the Sin Corner, where you can go for wickedness, alcohol, and so forth. But in the villages, everybody's safe. Everybody is a professing Christian. And the whole valley is saved. They have a Bible college. When I was there, they had 200 young men called to the ministry. They have a Bible college where for 2 weeks, all the young, out of every 3 months, all the young men come to the river town, and somebody teaches the Bible to them. And I got to go, I taught the book of Daniel to them for 2 weeks. It's the most Christian place I ever saw. So that when the Bible tells me that all of Asia got saved, that's possible. Because all that valley got saved. I was in India. There's a region of hills, and on top of every hill is a village. And one hill was famous for being the headhunter hill. It's where they perfected the process of shrinking heads. And they would hunt people, kidnap them, kill them, cut their heads off, and shrink their heads. That's what the village became famous for. Today, if you went to the United States and you went to a Ripley's, believe it or not, museum, they would have a shrunken head from that village. But in the early 1900s, a Baptist missionary came to that village and began to preach the gospel. And all the adults in that village, is a village of about 300, all but 3 adults were faithful to Christ as their Savior. They quit being headhunters. I had a chance to go there and preach. They invited people from 2 other villages, 2 other hills. We had 4 languages. I was being interpreted for 3 times. So I would preach, and a guy over here would interpret in one language, and then a guy here would interpret in another language, and then a guy over here would interpret in a 3rd language. All of the children understood English. And if I tried to say something funny, the kids would laugh, and then this guy would interpret, and his people would laugh. And this guy would interpret, his people would laugh. And this guy would interpret, his people would laugh. If I tried to be funny and I didn't get it right, and nobody laughed, the kids didn't laugh, I knew they weren't going to laugh, and they weren't going to laugh, and they weren't going to laugh. Every adult in that village came to the service, because every adult in that village was a professing Christian.
Wow.
They were building a church auditorium that would seat 800. So I asked him, Pastor, why does a village with 300 people in it need an auditorium that would seat 800? And their answer was, 100 years ago, no one would listen to us because we had killed people from every tribe. It's taken a century for everybody to get over it. But said now the stigma is gone. And we're going to buy, when we finish the church building, we're going to buy vans, and we're going to send a van to every hill and bring people to church out of all these hills. Everybody in the, so when the Bible says everybody in Asia was saved, guess what? Everybody in Asia was saved. It meant exactly that. That was not when Peter failed that day. That was not the end of Peter's story.
Wow.
If you failed, that didn't have to be the last chapter.
Yes, sir.
Or you could live in victory. And like Job, just see Satan defeated. Would you go with me to James chapter 4? But I want you to listen to this. It is another description of this process.
Amen.
James chapter 4, verse 1.
Amen.
From whence comes wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence, even if your lusts that war in your members? Ye lust and have not. Ye kill and desire to have, and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lusts. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. Think the scriptures say in vain, the Spirit that dwelleth in us left us to envy. But now look at this. It talks about this struggle going on. But He giveth more grace.
Amen.
You understand? The grace is greater than our struggle. He gives more grace. Wherefore He saith, God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Now look at the next statement. Resist the devil. You know why we have to resist the devil? Because the devil wants to sift us. Resist the devil. And what's it say? He will flee from you.
Amen.
Did y'all? Satan might win. He might win temporarily, but then you get right with God. Or you might win. You understand, the battle for eternity is won by the Lord. But you might win. You might live in victory. You might triumph over the fact that Satan is trying to destroy you. One of the most famous names among Baptist preachers is Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Back in the 1800s, he pastored a huge church in England. It was a huge church in a day when there were no buses and there was no public transportation and there was no radio and all that. The church averaged 5,000 a service. Man, when I say 5,000 a service, you're only allowed to come to one service a week because there's so many people in the come. They'd pass out tickets. You'd get a ticket that would let you come Sunday morning. Or you might get a ticket for Sunday night. Or you might get a ticket for Wednesday night. That was the service you could come to. And God used him in such a fashion. He wrote many books, and his sermons were turned into books. And even though he died over 100 years ago, every one of his books is still in print and has been in print that whole time. God just used him in an incredible way. Satan tried to fight Spurgeon. You read the story of his life. He had gout so bad, there were days he could not walk. And he had to preach in a chair. I've had some gout in my life, and I tried to keep preaching in a chair, and I'm telling you, that is no fun. He used to get depressed. He'd get depressed so badly, he had a little office behind the pulpit. He'd sit in his pulpit, or in his office. The church service would start, the people start singing, and he wouldn't come out. They'd go through the singing, he still wouldn't come out. And a couple of the deacons, and man, did God bless him with good deacons, understanding deacons. They'd go in his office, and one of them would take one arm, and one of them would take the other arm, and they'd say, "Pastor, it's time to preach." And they'd lift him out of his chair and walk him to his pulpit. I mean, Satan fought him. The man, did God use him? You could win.
Amen.
You could resist the devil. You could make him flee from you and leave you alone for a while. Doesn't say he'll never come back. But you could resist him and he'll flee from you. Y'all ready? The devil wants to sift you. He wants victory over you. You don't have to let him have it. He cannot touch your eternity, but he wants your tomorrow. Don't let him win. Pastor.
Amen. Amen.